This is A Story of Sorts, the podcast mostly about bookish stuff. Hello everyone, Karina here. On this episode I chat with Ellen Birkett Morris about her short story collection Lost Girls, her debut poetry chapbook Surrender, with some advice from Ellen regarding book publication. Have a listen. Hello Ellen, thank you so much for coming to A Story of Sorts.
Oh, hi. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ellen Birkett Morris, and I'm the author of Lost Girls, which is a collection of short stories that centers primarily on the life experiences of women and girls, women and girls as they struggle with loss, as they find love, as they meet challenges, and ultimately, I think, as they work together to create the kind of lives that they want to have. I am based in Louisville, Kentucky. In addition to Lost Girls, I'm also the author of Surrender, which is a poetry chapbook. And as I said, I'm really glad to be here.
And how did you become a writer?
You know, my father was a writer, so I was around books all the time, and I was around somebody who was at a typewriter many hours a day trying to write his own stories. He ultimately published a couple of books, detective fiction, that were set in my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, around the racetrack.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a lot of training just sort of seeing what the work looked like, and then a lot of exposure to books. And I knew it was something I wanted to do from a pretty young age. And having said that, though, I waited until I was in my mid-30s to really try it. You know, I was afraid of failure. I was afraid that I was going to be bad at it. So I waited a long time.
Was there any good advice from your father that you got or that he gave to you?
You know, one of the things that he didn't explicitly say this to me, but one of the things that I noticed was just the kind of work and persistence that it took, you know, the day after dayness of it. And he worked on it. He worked for years before he got published, which is often the case for people as they write and revise and make things better. So I think that was the biggest message I got, was that you hang in there, you know, and you do the work day after day. And that as you do the work, you become a better writer.
Talk about Lost Girls a little bit. Can you give us a summary of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a book that really covers the range of women's lives. So we've got very young girls in the book, and we've got older women in the book. One of the stories is Like I Miss Not Being a Ballerina. It has to do with a couple of young girls who are best friends. And one of the girls gets some bad news about her mother's health, and the way they comfort each other and hang together through that. Another of the stories is called Harvest, and it deals with an older lady who sees her reflection in a bus window and decides that she wants to take away all the mirrors in her house and in her business. And she can't reconcile herself with being her age until the end of the story, when she finds a way to come to peace with that. And so there are a range of 17 stories. Each is kind of quirky in nature. Each character has something different that they want. And it's just a deep dive on the lives of women and girls.
And you write fiction, essays, plays, and poetry. Are you still teaching?
You know, I do teach, but right now I'm teaching. I teach class by class online for both the Loft Literary Center in Minneapolis and the Carnegie Center for Literacy in Lexington, Kentucky. So it's a sort of a job by job thing. I'm not currently. I'm slated to teach some classes this spring. One in poetry and one in food writing. But currently I've got an open schedule for a little while, so I can continue to work on the writing.
And from fiction, essays, and plays and poetry, do you have a favorite medium?
You know, I don't. I will say that I gravitate towards short form writing. So the plays that I write are 10-minute plays, and the stories that I write are short stories. Although I've spent the last couple years really working to try to become a novelist. And so I've got a couple novels, one of which I'm sending out currently, another of which I'm in a second revision on. And so I'm trying to really stretch myself and find ways to expand what it is I think I have to say. And it's a challenge. You know, I gravitate. I started my writing career as a journalist, and so I was used to having a word count, and it was usually a pretty low word count. And so I feel like I'm pretty good at doing the short form writing. So So now it's on to new horizons to see how I'll do with that.
So it's been tougher to write a novel than to write the short stories and the poetry.
I would say so. Yeah, I've really and you know, there are certain important similarities, which is everything springs from character. So
Mhm.
yeah, so I have to really continue to examine, how do I want to populate my character's world? What sort of stuff are they going to have around them? What sort of stuff do they care about? How is what they care about going to drive the choices that they make and the actions that they do in the world? And motivate them. And so what I found is that if I front load both a short story or a novel with enough sort of authentic detail about a character, that can serve as a lot of fuel as I continue to work my way through the story.
Isn't a different process between collecting poetry for a poetry book and collecting short stories for a short story collection?
In some ways, it's very similar because I mean, so I truly believe that we all have things that we're drawn to write about, and so for me, it's often been questions of seeing other people authentically and being seen by other people, being seen and being heard, particularly women. This can be a challenge for us in our
Mhm.
society. So and with the poetry, I wrote a lot of that poetry when I lost my father, when I turned 40, when I went through some of the life challenges that come with getting a little bit older. And so what I find in both cases is that if you examine a body of work that you've done, if you look in your files and you look at the last 15 poems or stories that you've written, the chances are you're going to see that there's some thematic consistency based on the fact that you as a writer are exploring some of the same ideas over and over again. So with the poetry book, what I saw there is that I kept writing poems that were basically advising myself to surrender myself to the changes of getting older, accept those hard things, accept the loss of people that you love, of your father, accept the changes in yourself and your environment and in what you want out of the world. So that's how I knew that I had enough poems for surrender, was that I was like, oh, I've got about 16 of these that deal with really letting go. And then with the short stories, I had originally written them with a male protagonist, a male photographer traveling through the South, taking pictures of people. But what I noticed is that he wasn't that interesting, and the women he took pictures of were really interesting, and that each of them was struggling to sort of find their authentic self and get what they needed from the world and be seen. And that's when I knew lost girls, these girls and that, and that they may feel lost, but ultimately, they find their way. So
That's very pretty.
thanks.
I imagine that it's very different, as you already said, to write a novel or to write a short story collection. And for me, I think what seems more difficult is, how do you know that it's finished? Because a novel has an ending, right? But short story collections, how do you know it's done? It's ready to go.
Right, right. And I had the good luck of writing a lot of these and revising a lot of them and getting them published. And so the stories themselves I knew were fairly finished because the majority of the stories in the book have been published in literary magazines. But as a collection, what I had to do, there's a writer, Lee Martin, who was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, offered really good advice about ordering a collection, like figuring out what order to put them in. And he said, well, put your really strong stuff first and last, and then the other stuff in the middle. And
Mhm.
so as I did that, I also thought, okay, how can I do this in a way that sort of it has emotional peaks and valleys, and that it has a rough chronology. So the first story is the story Lost Girls, about a young woman who goes to commemorate the kidnapping of another young woman by leaving items in the spot where the girl was kidnapped. And so this was a younger woman's experience of memorializing a woman who'd been taken. And then I end the collection with an older character, a librarian who, as she gets older, is standing in this hardware store and looking around at her neighbors and sort of recollecting back on her past. So there was a sort of a young to old chronology the first story is a somewhat startling and sad story. The last story is kind of bittersweet and gentle, so I felt like I'd taken people on a bit of an emotional journey there too. But it really was. It was looking for stuff like that within the collection that helped me figure out that I had what I needed there.
Why did you call it Lost Girls?
I had written that story, Lost Girls, about the girl who commemorates the girl who was kidnapped in her neighborhood. And I think the idea in my head really was that women can get lost in the shuffle, that our voices can get lost in the room in conversation because there are louder and more forceful voices, and our dreams can get lost as we pursue other things like love, and that what I really wanted to deal with there was that idea, and not only ways in which we can get lost, but really ways in which, we can find our way back to ourselves, and the ways in which we can help each other find our way through life. And that, I was more than pleased when early review from the Southern Review of Books said the stories really show that we are the answer to our own erasure, that women ourselves come together to make that not a reality. And that was exactly the kind of thing I was hoping to get across. So I was really pleased to see that.
It seems like a very nice idea, because I do think that there are a lot of girls who are lost, but once they do find themselves, they make wonderful things out of their lives.
Right.
I do that's also the idea that I kind of got from the stories that I've read, and that's really nice to see as well. Are there any short stories that you thought that maybe you would like to include but you didn't for some reason?
There was one or two that I didn't include, and mainly I guess because I felt like I wasn't quite done with them yet. Like I hadn't quite figured out the puzzle of what they needed to be, and they weren't quite there yet. So I just stopped with the ones that I felt were really fully realized.
You have many love stories in this collection, and mostly they're actually quite tragic in some way. What compelled you to tell these specific stories, and are they purely fictional, or are they based on events happening around you? Because if I'm not mistaken, the first one has some truth to it.
Right. The first story was inspired by a kidnapping that happened in my neighborhood when I was the same age as the protagonist in the story. And I guess that story was born out of the fact that I was so saddened and frustrated by what happened with that kidnapping, and the way in which I knew that it was going to be forgotten at some point. I have to say, though, that kidnapping was a huge deal, and it led to the creation of the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is a national group that works to end this sort of thing, these sorts of kidnappings. But I wanted to explore it in a personal way about what one woman could do to remember another woman. So it was a real imaginative springboard. So I like to say that oftentimes what happens in the stories is the emotions are real, but the events are either, not hadn't happened directly to me, or if they just serve as a springboard to explore the idea. So, in the ballerina story that I mentioned, I had really close friendships when I was 8 or 9 with other girls, and we laughed together and supported each other and cajoled each other. But I never had a friend whose mother got a bad diagnosis who I had to comfort in that way. Yeah. So the emotions are the real emotions I would conjure if I was dealing with a friend who had that. But a lot of the other stuff is sort of is made up and is fictional, is a fictional framework in which to explore these emotions that are common to all of us.
Yeah. Is there any character or any story in the book that you relate the most to?
Oh gosh, well, that I relate the most. I think, I keep bringing it up, but the Like I Miss Not Being a Ballerina story has a lot of young me in it, that I was hopeful, that I like to laugh, that I loved candy, that I was kind of the chubby kid, that kind of I had a similar sort of best friend, so that has a lot of me in it. And so I love that little girl for those reasons. My favorite story in the collection is Religion, which is the story about a young virgin who wanders into what she thinks is a decoupage class, turns out to be a breastfeeders group. And because she's so lonely and these people are so lovely to her, she stays. She decides to stay. She creates a fictional child, and she decides that she wants to experience what it feels like to breastfeed. And it is just the craziest idea, and yet she sort of follows that idea through to the end. And I love it because it's both sad and funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think both of those things are so important. And I have to say, I read that aloud. I have an MFA from the Queen's University in Charlotte, North Carolina. I read that for my MFA reading, and I literally had a guy ask me if the story was true. And I thought, no. But I loved that it had enough authentic detail that he felt like it was true, which is
Yeah.
what we all want to do, right? Fiction is the lie that tells the truth. And so that's the story that I love the most because in many ways I think it's the most beautiful in terms of having all the complexity in it. And it has an ending that really, when I hit that ending, I thought, you've really done it here. It's got an ending that's very poignant and bittersweet. And so I'm really pleased with it.
I think it's really nice that it kind of plays with two things: our need to fit in, but also when we kind of get caught in a lie that we don't mean to, but we kind of go with it because it's kind of the best for us. I thought that was really on point in the story.
It was really, I have to say, it was really fun to write. And the thing I always have to ask myself as a writer is, can you go there? And there were times when I thought, oh my God, am I gonna, and more than one story where I thought, am I really gonna go there? And ultimately I let myself do it, and it was very, very rewarding. So part of it is give yourself permission to go wherever you need to go, wherever the story takes you, even if you feel like it's too painful or too outrageous, just go there.
I cheated a little for the next question because I was listening to a couple of other podcasts to get to know you better and your work better. And you talked about small towns and this concept that people have about small towns. Like I've also I grew up in a small town. I've lived until last year in small towns. You talked about this idea that everybody knows everyone, but how it's not really like that. Would you like to talk about it a little bit?
Yeah. And I think this could be true of like neighbors too, that we have this sense that we know the people around us, or that because we live on the same street, we share certain similarities, when in fact we may be vastly different. That's something I found here in the United States, especially with the recent election and the protest, that I put a Black Lives Matter sign in my yard and it disappears.
Ooh.
And you wonder, that sort of thing. Even my Biden Harris sign disappeared from my front yard. And you're thinking, what is going on here? So there is there's this sense we get that we know other people, and particularly in small towns, everybody's got a role to play, and that's the person she's always been, and she's always lived on this street, and this is the stuff that she does. And these stories really let me get underneath that whole idea of this sense that we know who people are, to get into people's really quirky, really unusual passions, the things they care about, and obsessions, and the things that we might never dream of, about our neighbors. And so I'm trying to think of a couple of examples of, in the story Swimming, which is the story that ends the collection, we get dual points of view between the guy who owns the hardware store and the school librarian, who's now an older lady. And we discover in the course of that dual voice story that the young man had actually on a walk through the woods, had wandered by the librarian's house and had spend time watching her take a bath through a curtain, through this
Mhm.
beautiful bathroom that she had that faced the woods. And we discover that she actually knew that
That
she
was
did.
great. I
Yeah.
love that. I was like, "Oh, she actually knew it. She wasn't just being watched. She knew she was being watched."
Right, right. And she was somehow, and somehow on some level, she just, it will, that was, I mean, it was through a curtain, and she was okay with that, which is a complex emotion, right? That's
And
very
maybe it's
complex.
also a feeling of power over her. Like, because she knows what's going on and he doesn't. Like, she has a lot more information than the people watching her.
Right, right, exactly. That's right. That can be a kind, as you said, that can be a kind of power, and so yeah. So it's that kind of stuff. It's the chance to explore those really personal, really quirky moments and things that people have in stories that makes those stories that makes stories so exciting. I think, and we're really sort of peeling back the veil on a lot of this stuff, and it's what good fiction does. It gets to the reality that lies underneath the facade that we wear every day out into the world. And so, in that respect, it was just great fun to explore these things. And I was constantly surprised by the things that came up in these
Mhm.
stories. I mean, um, I just again and again, it was a revelation. Things would just show up.
What was the best thing about writing this book?
Oh gosh. Well, I've written, so I started writing in my mid 30s, and I've written for a long time, and I've had some decent publishing success in terms of getting stories in journals. But the best thing about writing the book was creating something that was whole thematically, that dealt with a particular sort of set of topics, and that I felt like really dealt with it with some depth and humanity, and then getting that out into the world. The difference between having a story in a journal, which is great, is you have so fewer readers. And so with this book, I have a real opportunity to try to reach more women readers, and to have people share the book with people that they care about once they've read it, if they've enjoyed it. And so it's just a little bit louder of a megaphone, a
Mhm.
better chance to get these stories seen, and to see how they impact the readers. And so that's very, very exciting. Now, it's been it's been a tough road because of COVID. I mean, I can't do all the stuff I would normally do to promote a book, but I've really worked hard to try to reach out to people in hopes that these stories will find their readers. And that's it. I don't have any sort of dreams about the number of books I'm going to sell. I had no sense of how the book was going to be received, although I've been really pleased with the reviews. But the main job is for me to get this book into the hands of and I envision somebody like me who's looking for
Mhm.
who wants to understand the world better, or themselves better, or who wants to escape from the current world, and who would find this book a refuge. So that's what I'm hoping for.
And do you think that the pandemic was the most challenging thing about writing this book?
In many ways it was. In many ways it was, because, and I'll say that because I gave myself the time to put this book together. I would say this thing came together. I started writing these stories about 8 years ago. So I took the time to write and revise and publish these stories. I took the time to look at them and see if they fit together, to put them in the right order, to polish them up. So all of that, which normally seems like a tough thing. I just gave myself the time I needed to create what I wanted to create. So yeah, my main challenge really has been, how do you get it into the world when things, everything is so shut down. So that's
Yeah.
why I ask people, if you read it and like it, please review it. If you read it and like it, please let your friends know. Anything like that could be a word of mouth kind of thing is a huge help in these times, especially.
There is also a Lost Girls playlist. I will include the link on the show notes because I was listening to it and I thought it was really cool that there was a playlist. Was it made on request? Did you make it, or did you create the playlist while writing each story? How did it come to
Oh,
light?
so there's a fantastic fellow. I'm hoping I'm going to get his name right, because it's been a while since I've spoken to him, David Gutkowski. he goes by the name Large Hearted Boy,
Mhm.
and he has a blog. And in his blog, he offers an opportunity for writers to post playlists for their books, for their collections. And it
That's
was
so
just,
cool.
oh, it was so cool. It was the most fun to try to look at a story and say, okay, emotionally, thematically, what song does this match? I mean, I had the best time doing that and was able to really connect up. And then you have to write about, why you picked that particular song for that story. And so he does this as a regular column. So I would urge you all to check out Large Hearted Boy. He also, he does this all volunteer. So he has a donate button on his site. So if you love reading the playlist and the books that are associated with the playlist, consider donating to him. But it was really fun. And it was something I'd seen for years. I'd seen friends of mine publish their books and write a playlist. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to do that. So
That's so nice because it creates such a nice mood to go with the book and to rethink about the stories as well. I thought it was a good find.
thank you.
I think maybe you already replied to this one, but I'm gonna ask again because it's. I was going to ask, what's your favorite short story of the collection? Because I asked you about the character. You
Right,
talked about
right.
the ballerinas, but I'm not sure if it's the same. If like this is also the story about the ballerina that it's your favorite, or another one.
In a certain way, I mean, in a certain way, one of my favorites is Inheritance, which is a tough story, and it's my favorite because I remember writing it, and it's got a girl who's very oppressed and in very tough circumstances, and I had to figure out how she was going to get herself out of those circumstances, and I had such a challenge figuring out how she was going to do that in a way that was going to be really true to her character. And I felt like I nailed it in the story. And I don't want to give away any spoilers,
Of
but
course.
she makes a very dramatic choice in order to change her circumstance and to try to draw public attention to the ways that she has been exploited. And I remember when I wrote it, trying to make the choices about what was going to happen next. And I had to ask myself, given this time and these circumstances, what was she going to realistically be able to do? And I made the choice based on that. And I also thought, given her character, what would her choice be? What would she choose to do? And I made the choice based on that. And it was a tough choice, but I think it made for a very dramatic, powerful story. So
And you have given also various workshops, including one called Paths to Publication. Any quick tips or advice for people who would like to publish a book?
oh yeah. So past to publication, I really talk about how to build your reputation as a writer. And so a lot of this involves writing a lot, revising a lot, joining a writers group, taking classes, but also seeking publication in literary journals and other venues to build your credibility. And I guess the main thing I would say is keep working at it. And the other thing I would say is believe in yourself. We all have those moments where we think this is too hard, I want to quit, but we're the only people who can advocate for ourselves and for our writing. So, I had to tell myself, and I've been told this by other writers in workshops, nobody's coming along waiting to discover you. You need to push your own work. You need to have the courage to submit, to get the multitude of rejections, which are a natural part of the process. I've gotten hundreds and hundreds of rejections in the course of my writing career, and take the feedback that you get, polish your stuff up, and then try to find the right home for it. So that would be it. It would be that to believe in yourself and keep doing the work. Be your own champion.
That's solid advice. And I had never thought about that nobody comes for you. You gotta go for them and for your
Right.
work. You said that you are writing two novels. Are
Yeah.
there any publication dates, or do you know more or less, or anything you can tell us about that?
Well, yeah. So the first one is called Beware the Tall Grass, and I'm currently sending it around to agents and also to small press publishers. And it is a dual narrative story between the mother of a son who has past life memories of the Vietnam War
Mhm.
and the soldier whose memories the son has.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, we watched that unfold, the mother struggling with, and it's a fairly, there have been books written about children who have past life memories, and they're 3 or 4 years old, and they know how to do things they shouldn't know how to do, and they have memories of things they've never seen.
Mhm.
And so we watch her struggle to figure out what's happening with her son. And because she thinks at first he'd be a blank slate and she could give him a perfect life. But he has all these memories and she has to help him. And then we watch this soldier struggle as he goes from his farm in Montana and is sent to the Vietnam War early in the war. And we follow him through battles and we're with him the whole way. And ultimately the two stories come together at the end.
Sounds
And
super
so,
interesting.
yeah, well, and I'm very excited about it. I think it's got a lot of potential. My other book, the one I'm less further down the pike with in terms of being done, is the story of a female astronomer who leaves her home in Cleveland, leaves her mother who has Lou Gehrig's disease, and goes to Hawaii for a fellowship. And while she's there, there's an amazing celestial discovery. And at the same time, she begins dating a Hawaiian man who actually is an active protester against the telescopes.
Mhm.
That they place telescopes on mountains in Hawaii, and this man is actively protesting the placement of telescopes. And yet, these two are very connected romantically. So she's got herself in a lot of different challenging situations, missing her mother, dealing with the protests, dealing with the discovery, and trying to figure out, love. And so there's a lot going on in that one. And that book, I think, of all of them, is one that I think potentially could be, a very commercial book. I think it's the kind
Mhm.
of book people could read for a number of reasons. So,
That's great. I'll keep an eye on it so I can also talk about it on the podcast when they are out.
yeah.
Now, this is a question that I ask everyone because this is a podcast about books, and sometimes I introduce people that are not exactly bookish people; they're more entrepreneurs. So I ask for an all-time favorite book and a book you would recommend right now.
Okay. So an all-time favorite is Tell the Wolves We're Home by Carol Rifka Brunt. Just a sensitive, lovely story of the friendship between a young girl and her uncle and how she mourns him. Just a beautiful book. And then I would say, of the books that I've read this past year, and I read a lot of books. I do author interviews too, but for a print medium. One of the books that I liked the most was a book called Lake Life by David James Poissant. And uh, this is his first novel, although he's a great short story writer. And it's about a family at a lake, and they're all at a turning point. There are three different couples, the parents, the son and his wife dealing with an unexpected pregnancy, and their gay son and his partner. And so they're saying goodbye to the lake house, and there are a lot of things happening as they're making this transition away from this place that had been their refuge. But it's beautifully written, and I would urge people to check it out.
Ellen, thank you so much for coming to the podcast. It was really nice to have the chance to read your stories as well. I would like to end this episode by asking you to read a favorite poem from your chapbook.
Oh yeah, I'd be glad to read a poem from Surrender.
Would you like to tell us why you chose that poem?
Yeah. I'm going to read you a prose poem, which is a little bit like a short story. And I'm choosing it because I think it has those characteristics that I really value in stories and poems, which is it's got immediacy, it's got detail, but it's also got poignancy. It's got some heart in it, and it deals with the question of love. And so the poem is called What Broke My Heart. It was the spareness of your cabin, the slanted porch and wood gone gray, your tiny kitchen with one clean pot set on the stove, the small bedroom with the iron frame bed I was sure you inherited from your grandmother. It was the bottomland that made up your farm alongside the river, the God willing and the creek don't rise hopefulness of it all. The small patch of zinnias that you picked to put in our baskets each week. It was the story you told me while we stood by your truck of a strict father who didn't let you go to the movies, at least not the ones you wanted to see. Your worn shoe peeking out from the bottom of your jeans, the side of your back under your thin t shirt as you unloaded bushel baskets from your truck. It was your marriage to a woman who bought vegetables from you, and how I asked at the year-end party where she was, and you said, I don't know, as if she just vanished one night, leaving you a sky full of stars, but no moon in sight. It was the picture of you, your shirt off, young and strong, your heart still intact.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful.
Thanks. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you for these wonderful questions.
Thank you. You can access today's show's notes via my pod page, which you can find along with all of my social media links at linktree/Carina Pereira. In there, you'll also find a link to a Story of Sorts playlist available on Libra.fm, containing the audiobooks recommended by our guests, which will be updated as the show progresses. If you'd like to give Libra.fm a try, you can use the code A Story of Sorts at checkout to get 2 books for the price of 1. This offer is valid for new Libra.fm members in the US and Canada. Libra.fm is an audiobook platform which allows you to buy audiobooks directly from an indie bookstore. Check them out. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting A Story of Sorts on Patreon. Patreon is a platform which allows you to contribute monthly to the podcast in exchange for extra content, such as early access to episodes, a shout out at the end of an episode and on Instagram, and choosing a theme for me to talk about on the podcast. You can become a patron at patreon.com/A Story of Sorts. I'd also be very grateful if you would simply leave a review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. I will be back with a new interview in 2 weeks, but before that, I will still have another bonus episode, footnotes number 3, with the books that I have read in March. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss that, and I'll talk to you then. Thank you for listening.